Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Stacy. I'm a registered nurse. If you're new here, welcome in. If you're coming back, I'm so glad to have you. Let's talk about being a hospice nurse. I've talked about these things before, but let's go back to the beginning about my hospice career. And if you like what you see on my channel, then I ask that you like, subscribe, and follow for more. And let's get into it. Let's talk about stuff. So during COVID, I was working as an assistant director of nursing, and I had a lot of hospice patients and a lot of interaction with hospice. And over the years, that's been very common for me working in a facility to have interaction with hospice, going way back when. One of the things that I really loved about hospice and started getting me interested in hospice was the nurses that came into the facility and had interaction with me. And then also on top of that, the nurses that would come to the facility and do in-services for us that helped us to have an understanding of pain control and symptom management. Because when you're thinking of hospice, you're thinking of end of life, and the comfort measures are just a little bit different than somebody who is looking for pain management with high function, right? In hospice, we're looking to achieve a different goal for each patient at the end of their life. Some patients just want to be pain-free, and it doesn't matter to them how you achieve that. They want to make sure that they have no pain. A lot of patients express fear of dying in pain. That's something that I experienced working in a facility. In talking to hospice nurses and interacting with hospice nurses, I began to become interested in becoming a hospice nurse myself. But I wasn't sure how to go about that transition. And sometimes it's not easy to get into that because honestly, hospice is like a whole other world. It's like going to another planet. And the same thing is true of any other area of nursing that you're not familiar with. There's always a learning curve. There's always a training time where you're figuring it out. So during COVID, I was an assistant director of nursing, and I was getting burned out, and I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to find a place where I felt like I was making a difference and where I felt like I belonged. And I have a very compassionate heart about end of life and symptom management and dignity with dying. And in long-term care, again, you work very closely with hospice. So I applied for a hospice position, and I got a call, and I did an interview on the phone and ended up getting hired as a hospice nurse. And I remember joining the company and doing some training. I trained with a male nurse who had been in the military and was very experienced in hospice, and I was very impressed with the things that I was learning during that training time, and I felt lost. But the transition into hospice was a challenge for me. I had been in nursing for 20 plus years, starting as a CNA, as I've talked about before. The idea of comfort wasn't something that I was uncomfortable with. Some people, when you hear morphine, you hear lorazepam, you hear haloperidol, Haldol, you hear all the meds that are used for hospice, some people really have their own ideas about how they feel about that from an ethical standpoint. And so maybe I came into hospice with some ideas that needed correction. And I certainly came into hospice needing to know how to titrate those medications and what those recommendations look like, and what it looked like to use medications that would be similar to morphine laterally. For people who can't use morphine, for example, there's people who are not able to use morphine, and so they need something different. And I was very intimidated by the things that came into play in hospice. And I feel like the company that I worked for really gave me a good foot in the door and a good training and a good understanding of how to do those changes and how to judge those symptoms. Now, a doctor is always prescribing the medications that we give. Nurses do not make the judgment call, but it becomes necessary as a nurse for you to understand when you need to call a doctor to get those orders. And you do start to understand what that order is going to look like so that you can educate the family about how to administer those medications, which we can talk about in another video, because I think symptom management is always a good thing to review. But I worked with a couple of doctors that were very well versed in hospice and palliative care. And I think that it's important that you have doctors that you're working with that are not uncomfortable with administration of comfort medications and are not looking at it from the perspective of somebody becoming a drug addict. Because if you're dying of cancer at the end of your life, the least of your concerns should be if you're going to become a drug addict, right? And I love working with palliative and hospice trained doctors. Everybody that does hospice and palliative in hospice isn't necessarily, that's not where they got their start necessarily. And I've worked with doctors who are not comfort minded and their dosages are very conservative. And I've worked with doctors who are very comfort minded and their doses are right on the money. And I have seen it take a while for a patient to get comfortable based on where the doctor's at, and I've seen a patient get very comfortable. But what I loved about transitioning into hospice was the ease of being able to speak to doctors. I feel like when I worked in facilities, I was a little bit more intimidated by calling doctors when I first started because they seem untouchable sometimes. I mean, if you work on the day shift and you get to do rounds and things with a doctor, you begin to understand what makes them tick, what their quirks are, and what you need to do for them when they come to your facility. And I suppose that's the same of any doctor that you work with as a nurse. I'm speaking from the standpoint of a nurse because I'm a nurse and I work with doctors as a nurse. So I feel like I had an intimidating relationship with doctors prior to coming into hospice. I feel like in hospice, even though you're not seeing the doctor every day in the building, you're not in a building unless of course you work in an inpatient facility, I feel like you begin to develop a good rapport with the doctor and you begin to understand them and it feels like you're talking to someone you can trust. That's the experience that I've had in hospice. I love working with my doctors. I don't think I've worked with one doctor that I didn't have a great level of respect for as a hospice nurse. And we have nurse practitioners in different arenas that we work with in hospice as well. Depending on what state you work in, depending on what the regulations are in that state, you may be interacting with a lot more nurse practitioners. And I'm going to tell you, I love my nurse practitioners too. They've always been so approachable and reachable and felt like my colleagues. And I love the camaraderie that you build when you're working in hospice. It felt like joining a family rather than just going to work. You know, when you work for the right agency, the right company, you begin to feel like you are assimilating into a type of family. And those are the things that I was looking for, that I was missing prior to coming into hospice. When I transitioned into hospice, I felt like I was on Mars. I did. And I expressed that to the people that were training me. And I have to tell you that the nurses that trained me were amazing. They were encouraging. They allowed me to express my feelings. And you know, when we work in facilities, we're taking care of 30 patients sometimes. And you might have a patient die on your shift. You might have 2 patients die on your shift in a day. You might lose 3 or 4 patients in a week if you're working in a facility and you're taking care of a lot of hospice patients, or you have a lot of people at end of life. That's a possibility if you're working on a unit where you have a lot of patients that are actively dying at the same time, and that's a possibility. And the thing about it is, I don't think we're allowed to take time to grieve in a facility when we've been taking care of somebody at end of life. I don't think our grief is honored in a facility the way that it's honored in hospice. I feel like in hospice, one of the things that I've loved about transitioning over to hospice is that when your team is together and you lose a patient, yes, you have to go on with your day and give care to your other patients and provide them with compassion and understanding and be present for them. But I feel like that time when you're with your coworkers, you can say to your coworkers, you can say to your manager, you can say to the people who provided care with you, that really made my heart sad. That really, I felt sad when that patient died, or I felt sad when seeing that patient go through those symptoms, or seeing their family lose them, or they had a goal and they didn't meet the goal they wanted to meet, or they died suddenly and you weren't prepared for that death. You weren't emotionally prepared for it. It's not a true statement that hospice nurses can do this with no feelings. A common thing that people say to you when you work in hospice is, "God bless you, I couldn't do what you do." But I think that any nurse could give compassionate care and do what I do. Now, I definitely couldn't be an ICU nurse, so I couldn't do what you do. But as hospice goes, I'm not a superhero, and I never feel like I'm doing something that's out of the realm of nursing. I feel like every life has a cycle, and death is a very important cycle in life. It's the end of your journey. And I think that it's important to have people who care about people on the end of their journey, and people who advocate for those people to have the kind of death that they wish to have. Some patients don't want to die in a facility. Some patients don't want to die alone at home. Some patients have certain things that they want to accomplish before they die. And when you're in hospice, you can sort of set those goals. I would like to go to my granddaughter's wedding. Now, does that always happen? Can you always meet that goal? No, but the thing that drew me to hospice was the individual nature of the care. I didn't feel rushed to accomplish a task. If I needed to stay with a patient more than 10 or 15 minutes, it is possible. And I feel like I really love being a nurse and interacting with my patients. And I feel like being at the bedside in a facility, and with COVID and all the things that was changing, that I began to lose my passion for being at the bedside, because it began to feel like something different. It began to feel inauthentic and rushed. And I wasn't happy anymore being in that place. It wasn't fulfilling me in my career. I didn't feel like I was giving my best level of care that I could give. And something that I do feel in hospice is that I have the time to sit with my patients and get to know them. And that was something that really appealed to me, and something that I really developed a lot of respect for in watching hospice nurses come into the facility. I loved the rapport that they had with the family, the trust that the family had in them. I loved the way that they sat with the patient. Sometimes being a hospice nurse is brushing someone's hair, or braiding it, or sitting with their family and holding their hand, or, listening to stories about your patient when they were young, letting people reminisce. Because death is an individual journey for each family member and for each patient. And so I feel like hospice was exactly the calling that I was being led to. Now, that's not to say that I don't have days that are overwhelming, or that I'm not rushed, or that I don't have days where I'm stressed. But I can say to you with a level of surety that the level of stress that I have felt in hospice has not been the same level of stress and dread that I was beginning to feel working in a facility. So I came into hospice at exactly the right time for me. I had been thinking about it a long time. And I think if you have a desire to be part of that part of someone's journey, the dying journey, and you are concerned about dignity and symptom management, and you are concerned about making sure that a person's wishes are honored, and this is where you want to be, then I say come over to this side of the fence, because it's very beautiful to see someone have a peaceful death that is symptom controlled. I will talk about symptoms and, the things that people have misconceptions about in another video. So stay tuned. But I really just wanted to talk about what led me to joining hospice, how I feel about being a hospice nurse, and encourage anyone out there who's interested in joining hospice to come on board, because we need good nurses, we need good CNAs, we need good chaplains, good social workers. We need people to be part of the team that are interested in being part of a person's end of life journey and providing them with the type of journey that is dignified and choice driven and honoring them as a person. And I think sometimes we don't get the time to do those things in healthcare. But I feel like in hospice, if you really have a heart for your patients and you really want to be able to spend that time with them, then you're right for it. You're right for it. Not everybody wants to deal with death every day. And it's not easy to deal with death. And I think there's a misconception that hospice nurses, hospice kills people. And that's hurtful and horrifying to hear. I see a lot of haters and a lot of negativity about hospice, but anyone that I have had in my family that's been on hospice has had a peaceful, beautiful experience, including my grandmother and my aunt. And, you know, every death that I've been a part of has been my honor to provide my care and my services to those people and their family. And that's all I can say about that. And if you've had a bad experience in hospice, I'm so sorry. I wish that didn't happen to you, and I wish you'd had a better experience. But the goal in hospice is not to end life, but to provide comfort and to provide dignity and to honor a person's wishes. You know, if a person is ill for a long time, or they've been battling a disease process and they've been going to the doctor and they're getting older and it's getting harder to get around, or they're becoming more fatigued, they begin to want to stop their treatments sometimes. And I love that hospice allows them to feel like that's okay. Like it's okay if you don't want to keep going to the doctor twice a week, 3 times a week, getting out of your home, you're exhausted, you don't want to keep taking these medications that are causing you symptoms. These are all things that are taken into consideration and being honored. I don't know, when I'm 90, I probably don't want to keep taking chemotherapy either, and I hope my family will let me have a peaceful, natural, dignified death. Now, I know that there's other situations out there in the world that are assisted death, and that is not where I am at. That is not what I am doing. I am a hospice nurse, and I do believe in dignity, comfort, and honoring a person. So that's where I'm coming from as a hospice nurse. And if you want to learn more, then I encourage you to watch my channel. And if you have any questions, I encourage you to ask questions in the comments. I'll be happy to answer you. And I'm so happy that you came here and stayed this far. And I thank you for watching. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.